Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Rails to Trails Conservancy's Trail Expert Network. My name is Eli Griffin. I'm the Manager of Trail Development Resources here at RTC, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Our topic is Trail Towns, Proven Steps to Boost Your Trail Town Growth. Our presenter today is David Kahley, a 40-year community development veteran and CEO of the Progress Fund. David co-founded the Progress Fund in 1997 to help create economic opportunity in 9 rural counties of southwestern Pennsylvania, and due to demand for their services, they've since expanded to serve all of western and northern Pennsylvania, western Maryland, and northern West Virginia. When David saw the opportunity to use bike tourism to transform these rural economies, he launched the nation's first, longest-running, and most successful trail-based tourism program in 2007, the Trail Town program. In this webinar, David will challenge traditional assumptions about trail development with tales and insights about how diving straight into one good idea fostered the award-winning Trail Town program. He will build on the knowledge included in their Trail Town guide, which really is a fantastic resource, with additional tips about overcoming initial hurdles, growing and funding business development along your trail, and bringing in more trail tourism. David will also stick around at the end of his presentation to answer any questions you may have. And in case we don't have time to answer your question, or if questions come up down the road, you'll find contact information for David and myself at the conclusion of this webinar. But before I turn the mic over to David, I quickly need to run through some basic housekeeping. First, as you've probably already noticed, attendees will not be able to speak during today's webinar. All attendees are automatically muted as they join to keep background noise to a minimum. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, you may enter your issue into the question box, which can be expanded on the right-hand side of your screen. I will respond if I'm able, but your best course of action is to contact GoToWebinar's free customer support directly, or view a selection of help topics at the links shown on the screen. I encourage you to copy these down now before we move on from the slide. As I mentioned earlier, we built in some time for Q&A at the end of David's presentation. If you have any questions about the Trail Town program, please type them in that same question box at any time. If for whatever reason you lose the webinar connection, please re-click your login link. You will be able to rejoin the ongoing session at any time. After today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email containing a survey asking you to rate our performance on today's webinar, more information about RTC's Trail Expert Network with a link to sign up for occasional email notices from us, and perhaps most importantly, a recorded version of today's webinar. And as a bonus, you'll also be the first to get the Progress Fund's updated Trail Town guide, which has been enhanced with great new content and will be released next week. But I'll let David tell you more about that. So with that, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I'm here, I got it, and hello to everyone listening. There we go, Trail Town program logo. So 11 years ago, the idea of Trail Towns was a concept, great idea, but unproven. And from my own professional experience, I knew it would work, that if we did it right, it would kind of benefit the individual towns and the towns along the gap and the region as a whole. But the next step was to take my action, and that's what my organization, the Progress Fund, committed to itself to. Nobody else was doing Trail Town-like work in the country and in our region. Traditional economic development agencies were focused on smokestack chasing around here at the time. It worked, frankly, far better than I imagined the trail would be, the Trail Town program would be as a success. And over the last 11 years, we've learned a lot. That's why we did publish the guide, and it's there to share with you and others. I'm assuming that most of you received the guide by now. It is available at trailtowns.org, but I don't want you to run off right now. We will be sending it, and it's going to be a new improved version that includes some answers to the questions we get today, but we also have included other parts. What I'm not going to do is walk you through the Trail Town guide today. What I'd much prefer is to use the time to talk about overcoming some of the barriers that we had, what I think you might have to getting your program going. So let's get into that. So 3 common trail myths that we've noticed over time And I want to go through these. Small technical glitch. There we go. So we're going to have a poll now with Eli's help. I would like you to answer this question. Do trails make money for your community? So select one of the following if you would, and we'll all know what we think here in a second. Eli, we're not seeing an answer. Can you help me out? What our poll looks
Sure,
like?
yep. I'm sharing the poll results now. So 84% of you answered yes, trails make money for your community, and 16% answered no.
Okay. So the age-old assumption is trails will bring economic growth, but there is something really essential missing on the trails, and it's cash registers. It's the merchant transactions that drive the trail economy and why the trail has the potential to create economic opportunity. I would say to you all that it's the economic development that happens in the towns that actually really make the trail an economic development tool. So, little shift, it's not the trail, but it's the towns next to the trail that are actually the economic development driver. Here's an example. The Great Allegheny Passage has a trailhead about 35 miles south of downtown Pittsburgh called West Newton. In the background in this picture, you can see the Trailhead Visitor Center that was built by the trail organization. But trail users needed services, places to stay, restaurants, food, bike services. That wasn't provided by the trail organization. Great parking, great trailhead, but what we did was focus in our organization and major investments at the trailhead in the town. We did 11, and that's where the sales happen. That's where the economic engine of trail towns actually happens, when the cash registers are singing. Okay, so we're going to do another poll. Do you think more riders means more success? So select one of the following. And we'll have Eli jump in.
Yep, and it looks like most of you are finished voting, so I'll share the results now. Do you think more riders means more success? 83% of you say yes, and 17% no.
Well, it's not a trick question, but maybe. There is a difference of what those numbers really mean. So, big crowds, in particular on the Great Allegheny Passage as an example, those day users we have surveyed and looked at what they spent money, and they're spending about $18 a day, and they make big crowds. But it's the overnight visitor laying down $124 per night, that where the money's made and where you truly have economic development. And if you go further, if you start looking at a multi-day trip, which is what's happening on the Gap, 4 to 6 day trip, getting upward to $750 per day per rider, that's economic development, not the weekend day user from town. So that's where you want to go. The tourism community says it's heads on beds. So big crowds maybe is just not what you need. What you want to do is get those people coming into town and staying overnight. Here's an example. Judy Pletcher here is in front of her hostel on Main Street, a little town called Rockwood in Pennsylvania along the Great Allegheny Passage. She is in a town that's really keenly located along a certain stretch of the trail, but it had no accommodations. People would come in and ask her for a place to stay. She had a store there. They kept asking what they needed, what they wanted. Many people went down the list from a hotel they wanted that didn't exist to a B&B that didn't exist. They'd ask for a hostel or campground. So she, not even knowing what a hostel was built one and did extremely well by it. So next question, next poll, next common myth I want you to think about. Are you partnering with other stops on your trail? I'd just like to know. So go ahead and answer the question. What are you currently doing?
And I'll give it another 5 seconds or so. All right. Okay, and I'm sharing the results now. Are you partnering with other stops on your trail? 58% say yes, 43% no.
Okay, so let's tell you what we believe is your town alone can't prosper. It requires a regional approach. It is what made the Great Allegheny Passage Trail Town effort get the success that many people see and want to have in their community. It was a regional program. It was looked at that way from funders, from state foundations, locals, and it's what brought us the success we have. Individually, I just don't think it works. So we started off working in 12 towns along the Gap. As you can see the map, the Gap actually exists from the upper blue arrow down to the arrow at the Cumberland. That's the Great Allegheny Passage, the 150 miles of it. You can see the towns along there, starting in the middle with Cumberland, Frostburg, up into Myersdale, Rockwood, the town I mentioned with Judy Pletcher's hostel, Confluence on. They all became part of our program. And what we also knew and felt was what we call the 100-mile effect. The idea being that a rider that's going on a vacation is not going to go for a 25-mile trail for a one-day ride. They want some sort of longer distance that they can aspire to. They might not ride all 100, but they want to have that 100-plus mile. And that's when the true numbers, or I should say the numbers of trail ridership really increased along the Gap, is after we had a 100-mile continuous segment. So it's all about linking together. For those 58% that are already working with other communities, I think you're on the right track. With the others, if you can create partnerships, you're going to get the kind of activity and draw from outside the region. Over time, as more places opened, as the towns connected, as I mentioned, as we got the 100 miles, and as we invested more in the towns and made sure that there are services riders wanted, you could see the spending per rider for overnight riders increased pretty dramatically from 2008 to 2014. So we counted the business expansions. In the case of the Great Allegheny Passage, from 2007 through 2015, we had 25 existing businesses that expanded. These were due to trail-related increase in businesses. There's other activities in these towns, but what we did is identify the businesses that had some relationship to the services that trail users wanted, and we asked them specifically, did they expand due to the trail work to the trail users, and they had. The other thing was we had 65 new businesses. We had 72 that actually opened, some did close, but the eventual gain was 65 new businesses related to trail development. So what we're really talking about, for those of you who were curious, this is the Myersdale Trailhead along the Gap. But we're creating a system, if you would, a chain of services for the distant rider in each of the towns, in each of these trailheads, to enjoy the kind of travel they want and know that they're going to have the services to use the trail actively. So, how do you get started? And this is really, where do we go from here? So there are some common myths we talked about, but what I've experienced with the Trail Town program and being asked by many people across the country, how to get going, I keep seeming to run into three type of barriers that people mention, and so here's our suggestion on it. The Trail Town program is really the construct of three organizations. The Progress Fund, which I run, is an economic development organization, a lender. We've been lending to businesses throughout southwestern Pennsylvania. We saw the trail coming, and we had businesses calling us for loans. We saw the opportunity and went after it. But the other component, of course, is the trail itself. And the Great Allegheny Passage is the logo of the ATA, the Allegheny Trail Alliance, who really are responsible for years and years, over 2 decades of hard work getting the trail built and maintaining it. They created the asset. And then the Laurel Highlands, which is a local tourism promotion agency, as we call them here in Pennsylvania, doing a lot of the marketing for the trail initially, getting ads out, using some state money to really push the idea of the Great Allegheny Passage out across the country. And so it was those three efforts, the trail builders themselves, a marketing agency, and an economic development organization, that created a kind of a three-legged stool to create this regional effort and push it forward. So we skipped over a slide, but see if I can get back there. Nope. Well, it keeps, I'll try one more. There we go, pardon me. So in front of you is, for those of you who know Pittsburgh, you can see UPMC in the background and some of the art projects that were done in Pittsburgh and along the trail. These were some of the first things we did to grab attention, to start to create some interest in the trail. It was the initial splash. And it got people together, working forward, working as a movement in the region. The next barrier was actually getting it rolling, lack of funding. People talk to me a lot about it. Page. There we go. So lack of funding has been something that we get asked a lot of questions. How did you fund it? In our case, we went with the concept of a regional effort to seek funding from the state, from the local foundation community, and from local government. The trail builders were busy getting funding to get the trail built. The Progress Fund started worrying about how we fund a program, and how we do the economic development in the towns. We took on the towns while the trail organization took on the trail. We elevated the trail town concept to a regional program by getting all these towns to work together to buy into a regional movement. In our experience, we learned that by having multiple towns together, we could get the attention of state government, state agencies who are better working with a region than the request by individual small towns. So that was a key thing about putting things together. It was that joint effort by organizations in the towns that allowed funding to start to come to us. The other thing we did was use different types of funds and investments. In this case, you're looking at the Bright Morning B&B. The second house from the left, a white one, was owned by the couple here. They had a one-room B&B, but over time we helped them acquire the beige building to the right. It was a vacant, nearly abandoned building. We gave them loan capital to purchase that. The house on the right, the white one, we actually went in and bought that. Our organization bought it, sold it back to the Bright Morning B&B. And finally, the fourth building on the far left, we purchased ourselves, the Progress Fund, and rent it to this B&B owner. And so they now have four properties together. So I use this as an example of saying that using any way you can, getting financing, loans, whatever's necessary to make sure you can move this ball forward. So what we had at one case was one B&B room right on the trail where this picture is taken from. And now there's 15 rooms available for trail users right here back in West Newton. Other stuff we did to bring forth some money is the Student Conservation Association came in early and worked with us. They're known to work in the national parks, but they joined into our effort. And we had students in our towns for about 8 years, and some of them actually became full-time staff of the Progress Fund as they became, more experienced and were full-time hires. Other things we did with funding, we were able to get funding from major foundations locally to take care of information signing and signing along the trail. It is, if you survey folks, using the trail, almost the number one issue for them is they don't know where they are. They get lost. They want to know which direction the trail is. They need that reassurance. The trail builders, ATA, had built the trail and put signage, but the signage was not built for commerce. It wasn't what I would say, national standard for suggesting that trail users go into the towns, tell them about the history of the town they were in. So we sought, as the Economic Development Organization, the funds to increase the signage to a high level to invite folks into the town to make them feel, extremely welcome. The other barrier, I think, for getting a program going is distractions. And one of the distractions early on is naysayers. When the Progress Fund and others started talking about trail development 15 years ago, there was a lot of naysaying. The traditional economic development organizations felt that this was fluff economic development, that it wasn't going to create the kind of jobs we wanted. But we pushed that kind of thinking aside. Also, locals that didn't understand trail development, we would not be as welcome as we wanted. but instead we just said, that's fine. We didn't try to convince them. We didn't waste the energy doing that. We created small groups. We found the people that were really supportive of the idea and focused in on them. So one way to do that is to get going, to have your small group and getting it going, is to do a Trail Town assessment. We talk about that in the guide, but you want to get a small group of people that can start to look at the town and think about how you can move your program forward. One of the first things of a Trail Town assessment to do is find some projects to get done, to start to show movement. Nothing works better than actual physical improvements along the trail. The trail assessments, are basically that small group looking at their town with fresh eyes, trying to see what a trail user might see that the local that's looked at their town for so long might ignore. So these small improvements start to be small wins. I like the rule of threes. Get 3 things done. It starts to show movement and in success. So overall, our effort along the Great Allegheny Passage in those the years of 2007 through 2015, I talked about the jobs the businesses that were created, but we also created 270 jobs. We're getting 10 times more visitors than we did when we started, and every year there's $50 million worth of economic impact. So after that, with those years, with the experience, we decided to produce and to publish our Trail Town Guide. Many of you online probably got edition 1.0. From some of the feedback there, we've added some extra stuff like a program budget and some helpful checklist tools. So we'd like you to stay tuned for future updates. If you have somebody that wants to read it, send them to our website and they'll be on our list when we produce new ones. But if you're listening today, you will get an email copy of the new 2.0 next week or so. The other thing we're doing is putting together a Trail Town network. Basically, we're trying to come together with an information sharing tool that we will connect people from different trail groups and organizations that want to continue to talk about trail towns and what they might share from each other. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Eli so we can get into some Q&A.
Great, thank you, David. So we built in a good amount of time here for Q&A, and I do see a couple that have started coming in, but I really encourage you to type some good questions for David. He has all these years of experience, and as we mentioned, this is the most successful program of its kind, so he's a great resource. So with that, let me start off with this question from Virginia LeClaire. She was referring to your comment about student conservation assistance, and she wants to know what exactly they did for you because she's had them in her town but isn't sure exactly how to utilize them.
Sure. The Student Conservation Association started at the very beginning with us in 2007. And at that time, they were exploring using the students for economic development rather than what SCA traditionally did, was have students mostly in national parks working on trails or information. So they became, if you would, an aid to the economic development efforts. They were really helpful with us on trail, doing the surveys. They performed many of the processes for interviewing the people along the trail. They'd spend days out asking people what was missing. They organized the surveys. Um, we did counters along the trail, and they managed that for us. They also did some improvement projects in the towns, small garden projects. Um, but it was because they were 9-month employees, if you would. What we needed to do was find those kind of small projects that they could come in and do and add to the mix. So they weren't working on the trail. They were definitely doing things that aided our economic development.
Great, thank you. There are a couple questions here about signage. I'm going to combine them from Paul Coates and Doug Waite. It's generally asking what makes good wayfinding signage and what makes your signs so inviting for getting users into town.
Okay, so the trail, well, wayfinding is, a complicated subject. There's a lot of elements to it. The way I look at it is you want to make sure people know where they are and know the services that are around them and maybe something that makes that place special. So along the gap, there is signage that talks about the historic resources along the trail. The Great Allegheny Passage is an old rail line. There's a lot of industrial related type of, or I should say, bridges and viaducts and tunnels. So there's a lot of signage that explains that history, makes the trail, more interesting for the people to stop to read. We also had cases that people got lost on the trail. They would stop with friends, have a picnic. Somebody said they're going to ride off, and somebody else collects the trash or whatever and gets ready, and they look and they don't know which direction to go. So we had multiple instances where people were getting separated from each other and going the wrong direction. So we wanted to make sure that all those directionally challenged people knew where to go. The other thing were services. So that's, you got to know which direction Pittsburgh was and which direction DC was in Cumberland, Maryland. The next thing was services into the town. And this is really helpful, almost critical to economic development. You need to invite people into town. You need to let these riders know what type of services are available and which direction to head off. In our case, the Great Allegheny Passage went through some towns, went by some towns, or was separated by half a mile from other towns. The trail builders built their trail and allowed you to find parking areas, but it didn't connect you with the towns themselves. So our signage would, in the simplest terms, say services available 1/2 mile. We would say food, drink, accommodations. If you wanted to, you could also even name the businesses. Although the problem with that type of issue is that if the businesses change or the name changes, then you have a instantly outdated sign. So general services or the type of services available was important. I talk a lot about it here, answering your question, because signage was number one issue for issues that we asked people about in the early days. They didn't know, where they could find things. The other thing missing was actually good signage at the trailhead that looked inviting. And finally, the signage by the different groups that maintained the Great Allegheny Passage early on were done differently. As you rode the trail, the 150 miles, signs would change between 5 different groups, and that didn't give you the kind of, how do I put it, sense that you were on a important 150-mile trail. So by making all the signs all the same along the whole length of the Great Allegheny Passage, made it really reinforced, the length and breadth of the trail. Okay, Eli, next.
All right, great. Craig McLean would like to know how you got local existing businesses involved in supporting trail users.
Okay. I'll go back a little, even some theory of the trail and the economic development component. So the issue for the Allegheny Trail Alliance, when they were building the trail, there was two things. First, there was an absence of services that they felt that users would want. That was issue number one. And issue number two was how they convince local elected officials how important this trail was and would they support it. 15 years ago, we had far less, and there wasn't the proof of the successful trail, so we didn't have a lot of support from most of the local officials. So what we felt was it was critical to work with any existing business that it really had a nod to the trail. We were getting the early innovators that said, I see this trail opportunity. So we would help them with loans or help them with marketing. We would do these surveys, early surveys to find out what trail users wanted and go into different businesses and say, hey, look, this is what people are asking for. This is not guesswork. Here's actual numbers of people going by your door that you're not capturing. And so slowly, but surely, one or two businesses per town would start to move forward, and people tend to copy each other and look, where people are going. And it really created this slow avalanche, if you would, of people joining in. So targeting, we knew that trail users needed to get a place to stay overnight because they were going a long distance trail. We know they needed drinks and food. They were interested in little entertainment. That could be a restaurant or a bar, maybe a small museum. And they wanted a bike shop because they often had small bike repairs. So we kept looking for those type of businesses to fund and help in any way we could. We did not do an attraction strategy of trying to find people to move into town. We just tried to work with who we already had. Hope that helps.
That's great. Thank you. And you touched on it a little bit in your last answer, but there are a couple questions in here about how you worked with local politicians, local municipal level politicians, to make this program successful and bring more trail users to the towns. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Sure. So there's two groups really working with the local elected officials. It was the trail users themselves. They had promised for the trail building organizations. They had for many years promised economic opportunity because of the building of the trail. My professional experience taught me that if you didn't actively seek that development, it would come slowly and maybe not of the kind that you wanted. So you had to have an active program. So, and that's where the Progress Fund came in and said, let's get active. Our conversations with these elected officials were always about the economic opportunity. And the reality was that local elected officials, the small towns, they're pretty many are interested. They want to have that happen in their towns. So simply telling them that what we clearly wanted to do, which was create a range of services and small businesses in their towns, they tended to work with us. It was one-on-one, just basically creating kind of a relationship with them. We had people in the towns. We had full-time staff, two working in the Trail Town program in the beginning and through most of the years. And they would meet with these folks, explain what we were trying to do. And I think just personal contact worked really well at the local level. At more of at the county level, Pennsylvania has many counties and has elected officials, 3 commissioners. So the game in these towns was convince at least 2 of the commissioners out of the 3 that economic development around the trail was important. And we were typically lucky to get 2 out of the 3, so we would get support. What we did with them again is show them the survey numbers. A lot of this was new, I should say. I know that across the region, across the country, people have asked us for our economic development numbers because none or few others exist. So that was a prime reason that we were doing our counts on the trail to show growth and to show them what people were spending, and that worked. So again, it was just developing a good rapport and showing them results from the surveys. And over time, they bought into the idea themselves because their constituents were saying this is working for them, and it just became self-fulfilling. One side story is that I went to a ribbon cutting for a new part of the trail, and I was going to get up and give my normal speech about how this would help with the local economic development. And the person in front of me in their coveralls, just having cut grass, was one of the local township supervisors, and he got up and basically gave my speech talking about how this was good for his township, that he saw people moving in from outside, new young faces on the trail. He'd seen the small businesses develop, and he was a big trail advocate. So it fulfills itself, and you start getting allies. That's it.
Great, thank you. There are a couple of questions in this vein, essentially asking if the same strategies you've used along the Great Allegheny Passage, which is a very long trail, would work along shorter trails, say 25 miles in the case of Nathan Orager.
Okay. I tend to believe they will not be the economic boon that happened along the Gap. The reason is that most people ride 25 miles per day. And if you ride, out and stay in a town and turn around, ride back, that's it. It's a one-day trip. The real economic boon has come from people riding long distance. So, hate to say it, but I think that the big boon for rural areas is you got to be either on a long distance trail or create some sort of network of trails. With that said, we are now experimenting in the city of Pittsburgh, in some of the core towns, and along the Butler-Freeport Trail, which is north of Pittsburgh, in supporting businesses that are day trip type of trips. The reason is that Pittsburgh, as large as it is, has a lot of people, and I mean tons. And so they can come and spend their $18 a day and support the community. But the Great Allegheny Passage trail towns that were out of the city, past 50 miles, were not going to be day trips. We weren't going to be able to invite people out for the day, not in enough numbers. So we had to get the overnight folks. More people, more money from fewer people. I don't have an experience in Moab, Utah, but I know that they created a network of trails from one node, and it's been highly successful. Maybe there is a strategy there where your trail of 25 can, be more of a spoke for other trails. add to it. But the long distance trail is really what worked for us here in this region.
Let's stick to that one mode theme. Bill Young asks if you have any experience with horse trails and towns on those trails, and whether you think this type of program would work for those.
Actually, the Great Allegheny Passage is, I think, in most of its distance, is a multi-use trail, bike, walking, and equestrian. It seems to, not draw as many people as I would hope. Spend a lot of time on the trail. You do see, groups of riders, but it doesn't seem to have the kind of draw. I am familiar with some stuff about only from reading about them out west, where there are areas that are big enough to allow horses to ride and also graze. And I think they've had a lot of success. I can't tell you who that is, but I think it's a huge opportunity. Sweden has a trail network of cross-country skiers that works extremely well. There's a network up in Quebec that's also with ski from town to town. So our focus has been the bike here in southwestern Pennsylvania, but I think there are other opportunities. Word of caution, I think it's again about the numbers. There's an effort to kind of do a water-based trail in this area. I don't think it's gotten a lot of traction because there's just not that many people on the water, so raw numbers aren't enough. The bicyclist, most people can ride them, and so there's enough mass. So I think you need to do your research to see how many people actually would be coming, to your facility and kind of just do your market study. So that's my thoughts on it.
Okay. Tim Blagden is curious as to how complete the trail needed to be before the Trail Town program started working. Were trail users tolerant of any gaps that may have existed?
Good question. Like the other ones, what we found was in Pittsburgh they pushed through. There were areas that there were sections of the trail on either side, and they found ways to get around. Maybe they were tolerant, or maybe they weren't, but they definitely wanted to ride. We saw the pent-up demand. It was, though, I think that the trail really took off when the first 100-mile segment was produced. And people were disappointed when things weren't completed. So I really think you kind of got to get it done. I am familiar with other trails in and around Pennsylvania that have missing sections because key pieces are missing. Possibly bridges are gone, or you can't get through because of a reluctant owner that won't sell their property. Those have been problematic. We have not seen numbers develop along those trails. So access, completion is critical. The other thing I would say is that southwestern Pennsylvania, having seen many of the residents seen and used the Great Allegheny Passage, have bought into the idea of more trails. And there's a group here in this region, the Industrial Heritage Trail Group, that are trying to complete 1,600 miles of additional trails, create a huge network, spine of activity, if you would, a super highway of trails around the Pittsburgh area into northern Pittsburgh, western Ohio, down into West Virginia. It's got a goal of having a lot of that done by 2025. We're seeing some growth. The problem there is some of that trail is rail to trail and some is on road. And on road doesn't seem to pull people into the communities as off road or the rail to trail. The reason is that families are reluctant to take their small kids onto busy streets. A lot of people are uncomfortable. The gap, if you haven't ridden on it, is nice wide. Three bikes can pass each other, or two can pass another one. It's only a few road crossings. There's no vehicular traffic. It's just kind of a benign trail. It feels safe. So I have not seen the numbers of ridership where you have a section on road. Maybe a little detour, but the designated, safe, separated from traffic trails, what seems to be where you get your kind of trail town results. Hope that helped.
All right. A few questions came in while you were talking about wayfinding signage that are asking if online maps and information have made the actual signage on the ground less useful. That question is coming from Julia Hurley.
Yeah, interesting point, and I think we all want to get there. I think with everybody having an iPhone in their pocket, the only issue is internet connectivity. So there's an effort to try to get hotspots along the Great Allegheny Passage. You don't have cell service along the whole thing because it's in a river valley. I think that's going to drive in the future what services are available. We certainly see that before people even get on the trail, they're making their plans for where they're going to stay along the trail. So the B&Bs, are on there. That's where they're getting their reservations from online. So there's a lot of pre-trip planning. I think more of the signage on the trail is still it's easy. So maybe you sell the trip ahead of time on the internet, but you do need a fair amount of basic signage to where the parking is or which direction you're on, to restrooms, which are a big issue. People want to know where they are, rules of the trail, that kind of stuff is what we definitely have physically on the trail.
Great. There are a couple questions here too about the Progress Fund and Trail Town Program's operations. I assume people here are looking to kind of replicate your success in their area. Edgar Campa Palafox asks what the funding sources of your organization are. And there's another question here in a similar vein. Well, let's start with that.
Okay, so the Progress Fund formally is a community development financial institution. I'll say it again, community development financial institution. And you can look that up on, do a little Google search and find out what those are. But basically, we are nonprofit organizations. We're trying to work in distressed communities that don't have a lot of access to capital. In our case, the Progress Fund was formed because we're in a rural community and we don't have the economic assets or opportunities that you'd have in a big city. So we were looking for what was available in our region that you could create an economic boon, and trail-related tourism, was in front of us. Where we got funding was where other CDFIs get their funding, which is a range of federal, state, and what I call it foundation funding. And so our funding for all the investments and lending we did was the standard community development financial institution kind of sources, and I'll let you find that. What enabled us to run the Trail Town program, and you'll see the costs that we had in the budget, which is in the Trail Town Guide 2.0, is the running of the program. We did not subsidize the program with that investment money. Instead, we went to the foundation community around Pittsburgh in the region and also the state of Pennsylvania, and asked money to put 2 staff members in the towns to work to bring everybody together. Because I've said hopefully a couple times here, you got it, that it's a regional effort, that it's a lot of one-on-one conversation with people, and bringing the whole movement slowly forward and being committed to it. So we basically just went and asked who the sources we are for programmatic money. But I could spend hours on that, and I won't.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more. Here's a good question from Frank Wimberly. He says that they like to spend every available dollar on actual trail design, construction, and amenities. So what do you recommend as some inexpensive tools to help measure the economic impact of the trail?
Well, in our case, surveys, actual rider surveys. We would stop people along the trail and ask them where they were from by shouting out a zip code. We asked others if they wouldn't mind completing a survey that we would hand to them and they would mail back to us. There's probably a better system now, but they're not expensive. We worked with local universities that do statistical analysis and tourism development to work on those studies. They were $5,000 or less. I think some of them we accomplished at about $2,500. So those were great numbers that we were able to use, as I said, to put in front of local politicians and state politicians about the value of the particular trail that we were trying to promote. So low cost from that perspective. I also think if you only focus, I caution you, if you only focus your work on the trail, you can get economic development, but it might not be the type you want. It can be schlocky. It could maybe not serve what the trail users want, and you create an atmosphere of people saying, well, hey, that didn't work. So you really want to know what your users want by asking them directly, and then finding the businesses in town, telling them about what they could do, and by attracting trail users and get some additional sales, and you get your wins, and all that is pretty inexpensive.
Okay, and I think just one more, hopefully this will be a quick answer. Maureen Christ wants to know if you make any of those example surveys available to the public.
Yeah, the surveys, the survey information, those studies are available on our Trailtown site.
Excellent. Thank you, David. We actually have quite a few more questions lined up there, but I've been assured by David and his great Progress Fund staff that they will get to all the unanswered questions within the next week or so, and answers will be sent out accordingly. So you'll see, once I get this to work, here we go, our contact information on the screen in front of you. Any more unanswered questions about the Trailtown program can be emailed directly to David. And any questions about the Trail Expert Network and our webinar series can go to me. I want to thank everyone for their attendance and participation. I hope you found the presentation informative and useful as you continue to manage, promote, or support your trail, and especially as you consider boosting your Trailtown growth. Again, you'll be receiving a follow-up email shortly after this webinar with a link to the recorded version and a feedback survey, and we would really appreciate it if you would take the time to fill it out. We'll also be sure to pass along that updated Trailtown guide via email after its release next week. And with that, thanks everyone for attending. I hope you join us for another webinar in the near future.
Thank you.